Hello and welcome to episode 45 of Peace Matters, a podcast on contemporary geopolitics and international relations. My name is George Ljoka. I'm the project coordinator at the International Institute for Peace. In this episode, we will discuss the ongoing protests in Albania, now famously coined as the Flamingo Revolution. Who are the main actors on the ground? What are their goals? And what are the potential outcomes of these protests? And what does this situation mean for Albania's European aspirations? I'll be having this conversation with a very dear special guest. She is Gresa Hasa. She is an expert on Albanian rule of law, and she's currently a PhD researcher at the University of Graz. I hope you enjoy the episode. Gresa, thank you so much for joining us at the IIP today. You came all the way from Graz to have this conversation with me, so I very much so appreciate it. I want to jump straight into the conversation. What has been currently happening in Albania as of late? Could you briefly describe the situation, and then we can jump from that, basically?
Sure, thank you for inviting me. What started as a local environmental protest in Zvërnec, which forms part of the Vjosa Narta Lagoon in the western part of Albania, has developed into a broad movement against corruption and state capture. Protests initially started by mid-May, and initially they were composed only of a dozen of local residents as well as activists against the development of a luxury resort in the Vjosa Narta Lagoon, but also on Sazan Island. It was discovered accidentally that construction work had started against any formal regulation by an activist who happened to be in the area for private reasons. So this was made public through social media, and this is how the protest initially started. But what actually sparked this massive movement was the violence that occurred on May 30 by private guards of Castrati Group, which is one of the companies involved in the project. This project is backed by Affinity Partners, which behind which stands Jared Kushner and also Ivanka Trump. The whole idea is to develop this area, which is an environmentally protected area in Albania, with the purpose of creating a resort for rich tourists. So when the violence on May 30 occurred, people saw that, realizing that this is not just an unprecedented event. Like several instances like this have happened elsewhere in the country in similar projects as well. And what made it even worse is the fact that this violence occurred in front of the state police, who refused to intervene and instead shielded the attackers. So after May 30, the organization of the protest moved from this local area to the capital in Tirana, and then it spread elsewhere in the country, not just in Tirana, in several other cities, as well as in the diaspora as well.
Where you joined in as well in not only Graz, but also here in Vienna.
Yes.
Something that I want to firstly discuss, these protests have a very interesting nature when compared to other protests that Albania has gone through as of recently. You think of the opposition party, the Democratic Party. It's done a couple of protests, basically sort of trying to dismantle the Rama government, whereas this one, however, seems to have a very different turnout in the sense of bigger numbers and also more diverse crowds. What's so different? Why is the opposition not as present in these protests as it was before in the past?
Well, these protests are very unprecedented in the history of Albania since the fall of the communist regime in 1991, because they're not just protests against Rama's government, they're not just protests against the regime, but they're protests against the entire political establishment, including the mainstream opposition, that people see as the same face of the same corrupt system. So the protests that were organized earlier this year from the opposition, and by that I'm referring to the Democratic Party of Albania, which is led by its historic leader, Sali Berisha, like these protests, like the previous protests, they lack legitimacy. People have lost trust in this party, which has been disintegrating since they lost power in 2013, and which is a party widely defined by authoritarian practices as well as corruption. So Berisha himself was just released from house arrest recently on corruption charges. So what makes the current movement unprecedented is that it has no backing from any political party. So the movement is very diverse. It encompasses different groups from society. I mean, you have there civic movements, you have almost all LGBTQ organizations, you have environmental groups, you have as well more conservative as well as right-leaning individuals. And the only parties which are on the ground are these three newly formed political parties which have emerged from civic movements in the last years, such as the Together movement, which is a left-wing party that emerged from labor organizing and student activism. So, I mean, these parties are very small. They managed to enter parliament only with one seat as per last year's parliamentary elections in May 2025. Mm-hmm. They lack resources. They do not have all the necessary support because they're also not well known at the moment, but they're there and they're actually alternatives on the ground for the moment. So besides this, I mean, you just have different parts of the society who has just joined the protests. Professionals, university professors, students as well, even the elderly, they have joined the protest. Such a protest movement has never before been seen in Albania, and it should be understood not only as a resentment of the government's current actions when it comes to this specific project, but also and specifically as accumulated anger of 35 years of living in a country where governments change, but nevertheless, the semi-autocratic structure of governance is preserved, where democratic institutions exist, but they're captured, where the media is captured by the regime, and where people are striving to make ends meet, and where your basic fundamental rights are constantly compromised.
And it's very interesting that you kind of already mentioned the small parties that have been very much so present in the protests themselves. However, that goes to sort of question the ulterior motive behind these protests. Is it to overthrow the government of Rama? Is it to create a solid opposition, one that would dismantle then the Democratic Party? The critics have come to show, and this is not necessarily in the case of Albania alone, but in the case of also other protests across the region and also the globe, what is the motive? You have so many diverse stakeholders, whether that would be civil society actors or these third parties or even religious groups that are chiming in and, you know, for a certain cause. But in terms of institutionally, do they have power to make change happen? What is your opinion on that in terms of the Albanian context?
Well, it is a bit difficult for the protest movement to achieve all of its demands. I mean, the main demand of the movement is the resignation of the government. They want Edi Rama to step down, and they're not compromising on it. Today is the 36th day of the protests, which are continuing uninterruptedly. They want as well, you know, that the current project on the Vjosa Narta Lagoon, as well as on Sazan Island, to be cancelled. They want as well the law on protected areas to be changed and for the strategic investor framework to be cancelled. I will explain why this strategic framework is important and the amendments on the law on protected areas as well. But I find it difficult for Rama to, I find it difficult that the government will resign due to this pressure, due to this protests. Of course, the pressure is quite high, but nevertheless, Rama has external backing, and that is also important. Nevertheless, I see as a success story of this protest movement in the short term the cancellation of the project with a lot of pressure coming from the European Commission. that is mandatory for that to happen. I also see that things cannot go back to where they were before. I mean, this protest movement has served also as a very good political lesson in civic movements and in how civic activism can be manifested, but also in how we collectively are envisioning the future of our country. And long term, I see the best possible outcome the replacement of the current mainstream opposition with a new democratic and legitimate opposition. I don't know if any new political force will emerge from this protest movement. If a new political force emerges, which embodies all the democratic values that the current movement has, that would be great news for democracy and for pluralism. But nevertheless, I want to say that as we wait for this to happen or not in the future, there are already alternatives on the ground which have emerged in the last couple of years, and it is very important that these alternatives are acknowledged. It is very important that they're supported, and I find it particularly important for the EU to establish direct contact with them rather than narrowing the entire enlargement process to only one political actor. I mean, I understand that Edi Rama is the prime minister of the country, but there are also democratic actors on the ground which deserve acknowledgement, because this sort of acknowledgement will help them, you know, like to be further legitimized also in the public's eye. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting that you brought up how the EU, or rather external actors, have sort of narrowed the enlargement process. I mean, Albania is second on the line to join the EU after Montenegro, and it's that image is confined to only the executive power and mostly Rama. I mean, you see him go around sort of flaunting his sneakers and sort of being friendly with different European leaders. However, Rama has had other issues in the past couple of years, or rather Rama's government. We can mention here the mayor of Tirana, who is still in trial, from my understanding, or rather imprisoned. You also have the prime minister, who also was sort of vindicated as sort of a corruption case by SPAC, the anti-corruption organization that is both funded by the EU and the US. I want to ask what you think of sort of the image that Albania has managed to craft itself in the wake of its EU accession, and how this could potentially challenge our European aspirations.
Well, for his last 13, sorry, I was about to say 35, God forbid. For the last 13 years in power, Edi Rama has crafted an image of himself internationally to present himself and his government as socialist, progressive, as visionary, and especially, you know, like he has framed himself as this cool leader who entertains Brussels bureaucrats, you know, with his very questionable sense of humor, I'd say, but nevertheless. And what we see happening now is that this entire image has started to crumble, and outside of Albania, Edi Rama is being viewed for what he is, a semi-authoritarian leader who's violently trying to suppress democratic protests and peaceful protesters in his own country, who's vindictive and acts as a bully towards independent media. I mean, we have seen this not only domestically, but also internationally at the moment. And who behaves not as an elected leader, but as a private owner of a country who can sell parts of it whenever he deems fit for his own political interests, and who uses his political power to push forward dubious projects with no transparency at all. And at the same time, you know, they're also changing the law. They're amending the law to open up way for intervention in environmentally protected areas, or to change the status of cultural and historical sites, so that Rama's oligarch friends can have it easier, to intervene and to construct in these places, which, by the way, most of them at the moment are under investigation for Albania's special corruption against Albania's structure against corruption and organized crime, SPAC, for money laundering. And that is a grave accusation. Rama is dismissing all of this, but nevertheless, what the world is seeing is that he's behaving exactly as the semi-authoritarian leader that he is. And at the moment, at least, values of the European Union, at least as they are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, are better represented in this protest movement rather than by Albania's government at the moment. Because the current project goes against Chapter 27 of the Acquis on Environment. But it's not just that. I mean, the issue is not just environmental issues. I mean, of course, these are very serious and important issues also when it comes to Albania's EU accession process. But at the core of it all is a deepening of authoritarian practices, a governance which behaves with no democratic safeguards and with no transparency at all. So it's not just it's not just the fact that the project goes against Chapter 27 of the Acquis. The problem lies also that the behavior of the government goes also against Chapters 23 and 24, which form the core of the rule of law framework of the EU accession process. And this needs to be acknowledged. I mean, enlargement process cannot just be an exercise in geopolitical expediency. I mean, we can see now that there is an expedited process when it comes to Albania and Montenegro to become part of the EU accession process. But what people are demanding on the ground, and what all of us are saying, is that we don't just need the EU integration process to be merely formal. I mean, it needs to employ democratization as an uncompromising feature of it. I mean, otherwise, I find this very problematic long term, not just for Albania, but both for Albania and the EU. And I want to say that the EU has a lot of leverage when it comes to EU candidate states like Albania. So what it can do, it can just stay true to its own regulations and conditionality framework and demand that candidate states are actually complying with the conditionality framework and not just pretending to. Because on paper, Albania seems, great.
Quite great.
We're doing quite great. Albania is a front runner, but look at the situation on the ground. And But
it's interesting, speaking of the situation on the ground, I mean, Marta Kos, the Commissioner for EU Enlargement, has actually been very much so praising both the protests and yet at the same time also the government. I want to read two quotes that she said that I think are very relevant. She said at one point, "We've received guarantees from the Albanian government that a full environmental impact assessment will be carried out and that European environmental protection standards will be respected." And at the same time, she also says, "You know how important the right to protest is for the EU. It's a fundamental right and for all countries that aim to become part of it." So it seems as if there's a clash within these statements, and there's also a clash within the European Parliament. There's members of the European Parliament that are very much so needing desperately for Albania to become part of the EU in terms of geopolitical strategic significance or whatnot, or maybe the idea of there being a package accession process alongside Montenegro. But there's also the other side of this integration doesn't seem to be doing quite well on the ground. Something very interesting that I want to bring up here, however, is this could very well have been a very domestic issue within Albanian context alone, but you're seeing flags of the European Union all over, and you're seeing signs saying, "Europe, are you hearing us?" And I think that's also what has made this movement so much more interesting, I guess, to the European perspective. I'm curious to hear your perspective, however, on the flip side, on the American side. I mean, this project is connected to both Kushner and Ivanka Trump, backed obviously by Donald Trump himself. I'm curious to hear what you think of that relationship from now on, rather the American investments that have been made, or rather will be made to Albania, and how that affects our foreign policy, perhaps.
All right, you had several questions, so I will start with the Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos. Her statement was very disappointing, and it has not sat well with protesters on the ground and generally citizens in Albania, because Marta Kos is speaking about future guarantees from the Albanian government, and people are very eager to understand what guarantees is she actually referring to, and why are we speaking about future guarantees? I mean, until now, first of all, this is a semi-autocratic government which until now has constantly proved that is not reliable. Secondly, there's damage which was done because construction work started against regulation, and the entire project has been pushed forward in very dubious ways, and it is currently under investigation by Albania's Special Structure Against Corruption and Organized Crime. So these are all facts that have happened. So what does it mean, like future guarantees on protecting the environment? That's nothing. It doesn't stick. Mm-hmm. So how that translates to the people who are seeing and hearing that statement is that, okay, the Commissioner for Enlargement is just patting Edi Rama on the back for, in the name of some perceived stability, and that's it, and ignoring the situation on the ground. Because Marta Kos did not meet with any of the protesters. She did not even acknowledge what is currently happening in Albania. She just went on to say that we were just granted future guarantees from the Albanian government. But at the same time, as you mentioned, you also have Europarlamentarians who have stood by the side of the protesters, who have traveled to Albania to join the protests, who have held speeches within the protest movement. And only recently, the European Parliament also passed a resolution that acknowledges all the demands that are coming from the protest movement, and which is putting pressure on Edi Rama to listen to the protesters and to comply with their demands, particularly the ones concerning this specific project and the ones concerning the amendments or cancellations of the respective laws. I have to mention that, the Albanian government changed the law for the protected areas in 2024 to make it more easy for intervention and construction in these zones. But the way how the law was changed was very weird, and now SPAC is also investigating how the law...
It was not made public, or was it at the time, from your understanding?
No. Well, all of this have happened, in non-transparent ways. Mm-hmm. Rama has the majority in the parliament to make changes, especially as per last year's parliamentary elections. They have 82 seats now in parliament with 140. They used to have 83, but one of their deputies stepped down due to the pressure coming from the current protests. So there is an interesting aspect, because there is a book which has just been published by a publishing house in the Netherlands, which is called The Albanian Files, and it is there you can find draft projects from architectural studios, international ones, for development, luxury tourism, projects or real estate in environmentally protected areas that predate the amendments that have happened, in the law on protected areas in 2024, which raises a very important question that these architectural studios, these businessmen who moved on, who moved forward, all this, it's money that has been spent, for architects, designers, business groups, and all of that to draft these projects. They did all of this when the law was not amended. So the question is, what guarantees did they have that, the law was going to change, or that this was going to be made feasible for them to construct, to move forward with their plans in these environmentally protected areas. So this brings us to a point where we're thinking that the government has changed the law specifically to make it, more feasible for all of these actors to move forward with these plans. And I mean, this is a classic understanding of state capture. So, Yeah.
But on the...
Because you asked me also about the enlargement, and you also asked me about the US.
Yeah.
So it's something very interesting in this protest is the fact that the EU is a relevant actor. Something which I have not seen, for example, in the protest in Serbia, in the recent student protest in Serbia. EU is a relevant actor, and protesters are still looking up to the EU. I mean, you don't see many EU flags, to be honest, but there are a lot of signs oriented towards the EU, because people are trying to form bridges of communication with the EU. Like, for example, can you hear us, or help us, or, I don't know, put pressure on the Rama government, and so forth. Albania is one of the most pro-EU countries in the region, but this support should not be taken for granted, because if the Commission continues to ignore what is happening on the ground, to ignore the demands as well as the strive of the Albanian people for democracy, and the fact that they are requiring that democratization is an uncompromising feature of the Europeanization process, they risk creating a situation when there is more Euroscepticism on the ground, and I don't think that is good, neither for Albania, but also for the EU as well. When it comes to the United States, what is very ironic is that you have several protesters going to protest with the American flag.
Yeah.
And also, like, international journalists were asking me, like, why is the American flag present? I mean, Albania is a very pro-EU country, and many protesters want to show that they're not against the EU. So these protests are not anti-American, but they are against this specific project and members of the Trump family being involved in an endeavor which is lacking transparency, and, you know, behind which there are so many questions, including allegations for money laundering. So this is what protesters are standing against. They're not against the US, but they are against, of course, a foreign billionaire like Jared Kushner coming and finding different ways to justify what is literally land grabbing for the purpose of developing an area for luxury tourism aims, from which, you know, the Albanians will not actually benefit, because, you know, also from an economic perspective, how these resorts, like the idea behind these resorts is that all the money stays inside and doesn't go outside of the resort. So this functions like an enclave, you know? I mean, there is what in economy would be called economic leakage. Guests stay in these resorts, they eat there, they sleep there, they spend their money there. So money doesn't go to local businesses or doesn't like get distributed in the society, but it remains trapped within this very small conglomerate of international businessmen and the very few local oligarchs who are providing their services when it comes, you know, to cheap labor and construction projects and so on. And at the same time, the Albanian government is providing accelerated procedures because, of course, Affinity Partners has the status of strategic investor, which means that they are exempt of a lot of regulation.
And what I want to note here, however, is last year in 2025, Albania had 12 million tourist visits, which is incredible. I mean, for a 2 million people population, I think that's immensely impressive. However, Rama recently said that that's not actually quite good, and he would rather have not mass tourism, but have luxury tourism. And I appreciate that you already mentioned, well, you know, the money sure is being invested onto these properties, but they're not necessarily transpiring onto the common folk. You even see in the Tirana Square, for example, there's so many skyscrapers that you have no idea what their purpose are. You have no idea how they got their permit in the first place. It's just, they're there for a particular reason that the general public is just not unaware of, which goes to show how do we evaluate these sort of economic arguments against concerns regarding the environment and also the lack of economic growth around the people? How is this being communicated now by the government, would you say?
Well, Edi Rama is using the argument that Albania cannot turn down a $4 billion investment because this is good for the country and this will contribute to Albania's economic growth, which is very dubious as an argument because, as I mentioned, you know, like this money will not circulate within Albania. And, you know, like the question is not simply like how much wealth the project creates, but who actually benefits from it. You know, like does this project generate broad-based prosperity for Albanian workers and local businesses, or does it concentrate the economic gains in the hands of a few international investors and, well, the oligarch friends of the prime minister? And it doesn't look like the project, you know, is going to create, you know, like mass employment, it's going to hire people, this money is going to flow within Albania. And that's not the case. I mean, Albania is not the first nor the last country which is trying, you know, like to create, no, not to create, but like which is trying, you know, like to just push forward projects that don't do nothing more at the end of the day, but mainly create different forms of capitalist dependence. So that's what this is at the end of the day. You can build, you can, as a government, you can work towards expanding tourism in the country in a way that is eco-friendly and in a way that it incentivizes, you know, also small businesses to be part of this vision, if this vision would exist, you know, but there is no vision like that. I mean, Edi Rama has clearly said, he has clearly stated that he doesn't want the backpackers, that's what he said in one of the interviews, but that instead he prefers to have this elite, luxurious tourism, which is just a lie that is being sold to the Albanian people, telling them that, you know, you're just going to get rich very fast, you know, if these billionaires are going to come to our country. But actually, money is just circulating into, you know, the same people.
Isolated people, yeah.
And this economic elite, which is deeply connected to the political power. And because, you know, I mean, in the last 35 years in Albania, this is what has happened. You know, like there is like small economic groups which developed also with ties to organized crime. Some of them eventually became legitimate businesses and turned into powerful oligarchic entities. They managed to stay in close contact with political power because they provide political parties, like mainstream political parties, with the resources that they need to either come to power or to maintain power. And on the other side, the political party which is in power, like it is a socialist party right now, it used to be the Democratic Party of Albania until 13 years ago, they make it feasible for them, you know, by changing laws and creating the opportunities for them, you know, to continue with their business projects. Is it construction or is it, as prosecutors are finally saying, using also construction work and all of these projects to actually launder money that are coming from international cocaine trade?
Recently, last month in June, Western Balkans leader and EU leaders convened a conference, or rather a summit in Tivat, Montenegro, where they discussed the future of EU enlargement. Most specifically, Montenegro was very much so praised, and so was Albania. My question, however, is, would you say that now, upon these concerning sort of situation in the civil society, and not only even the environment in Albania, would you say that the EU then lacks credibility through the Albanian lens? What's your opinion on that?
Well, it does not lack credibility at the moment. As I said, the EU is still regarded as a very important actor that citizens of Albania believe can use its leverage to put more pressure on the Rama government. And this is important, and I think this should be acknowledged, because it is not guaranteed that this support or this approach towards the image of the EU can always be like this. I mean, we have also cases in the region, such as North Macedonia, for example, and look what happened. It used to be a front runner, and now it's in a situation where politically, there are a lot of issues. You have a far-right government, increased nationalism, and a lot of Euroscepticism. So we don't want that to happen. And as I mentioned earlier, the EU still has a lot of leverage when it comes to Albania. This is an asymmetrical relationship between the EU and candidate states like the ones in the Western Balkans. And nobody is asking from the EU to do anything extraordinary rather than, just stick to its conditionality framework. Because we need to move towards an EU accession process that is genuinely transformative for the country and for the EU. Democracy is not something that the Albanian people are willing to compromise. And they are making this very clear. At the moment, citizens of Albania are already doing their job, and we're just requiring for the EU to do the same, So, yeah.
I asked that because, And
if I may also add something else, sorry. It's very interesting to see what is politically happening at the moment in Albania. And I'm not just referring to the massive protest movement, but also to the fact that you have a lot of members of the Socialist Party which are distancing themselves from Edi Rama at the moment. And I'm talking about senior members of the party who have been there since the very beginning, since the 90s. And they are openly talking against corruption, against authoritarianism, and against the involvement of organized crime in state structures. This is heavy, this is big. The EU can try to establish contact with these specific actors within the SP. And at the same time, it can also attempt to build bridges with the newly created political parties, which are democratic. Each of them has a very well-identified ideology, and at the same time to maintain contact with civic movements. Because, the parties that I just mentioned, like Together Movement, Opportunity, and the Albania Becomes, these are the three parties, they have emerged from civic movements and from grassroots movements. But the moment that they turned into political parties, the civic space also shrunk. So of course we have now civic groups that are doing an amazing job, as we can also see, but they're very small, and I think that if the EU would acknowledge them, if the EU would try to build bridges with them, it would also help them. It would help legitimize them, and it can also contribute directly and indirectly to their growth. And I think this is very important. You cannot just reduce the entire enlargement process to one political actor. I understand that Edi Rama is the prime minister of Albania, but you have democratic actors. You have a semi-autocratic leader, and you have democratic actors. And I think that, if the EU would establish these bridges with these actors, it could really help, that it could really help that things are changed domestically from within.
And to add to that, you can use the same argument about a couple of other countries that are already in the EU. With Hungary, for example, it was sort of considered as this very anti-European EU country, only despite the fact that, the civil society was already protesting and there was already a lot of, actors, stakeholders there that were pro-Europe. However, the government was not. The same argument could be said about Slovakia as well, Poland at one point too. So there definitely needs to be a reframe of the narrative that a country's people is their government. However, the reason why I brought up the credibility issue of the European Union has a lot to do with sort of the conditionality crisis regarding the Western Balkans in total. We mentioned North Macedonia, for example. The same case could be applied to Serbia at one point, Montenegro at one point as well. However, when it comes to Albania, I think Albania is in a very interesting route because it's completely separate from these ethnic tensions. However, when it comes to, for example, the migrant agreement with Italy, another EU member country, you didn't necessarily see as much of a backlash or a downslide from the European Union side. To give some context, Italy and Albania signed an agreement that would basically take illegal migrants trying or attempting to go to Italy or flee to Italy, that would be, for them to be stationed in Albania. Rama was very proud of this deal, and so was Meloni. It got to the point where the UK government also attempted to establish some sort of similar connection to that of Albania. And this, in principle, I think you would agree with me, is not democratic whatsoever.
It was also endorsed by the EU Commission and President Ursula von der Leyen herself, which I find quite problematic.
So therefore, my question would be, and I think this is the very last question, do you think that the EU nowadays is keeping both the Flamingo Revolution, because that's what it's going, by the way, I don't think we mentioned that up until now, but alongside the Flamingo Revolution and also the Italy and Albania migration agreement, is the EU then willing to overlook governments for strategic purposes?
Well, the problem is that the EU seems to be asking candidate countries to act like member states when it serves its own interest, be it migration management in the case of Albania or critical raw materials in the case of Serbia. There was an EU-Serbia lithium deal that was signed in July 2024 amid massive protests in Serbia, and the situation was similar in the sense that the EU chose not to acknowledge the situation on the ground, not to acknowledge the protesters. It chose to alienate democratic forces within Serbia to move forward with this deal. So both of these deals, like the Italy-Albania migration deal and the EU-Serbia lithium agreement, are good examples because they show how strategic interests seem to take priority over democratic accountability. And that creates the impression that democratic standards become more flexible whenever geopolitical interests or economic interests are at stake. But this is dangerous, I believe, because the enlargement process was never meant to be, just formality. I mean, it was meant to transform countries by strengthening democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. And of course, this brings a big question marks when we're thinking, about the way forward in which we're moving in this EU enlargement process. So these are good examples that show that the EU is willing, to put aside its own conditionality measures and even its own values when it comes to this strategic interest. And I'm highly critical of that. And I think that the enlargement process, first of all, should not be led by individual EU member states, such as Italy or Germany in this case, or even France. And at the same time, it should ensure that it cannot be finalized without candidate states obliging to the conditionality framework genuinely, not just formally, but genuinely, without them actually delivering on reforms and without them considering this. But yes, I mean, you have a crisis within candidate states in the region at the moment, but you also have a crisis within the EU itself, and within the Commission, and how the enlargement process is envisioned, how the enlargement process is pushed forward, that I think needs to change. But at the moment, we are seeing that countries in the Western Balkans are really attempting to change things. I mean, this protest in Albania, it's unprecedented. For the first time in 35 years, people have managed to overcome fear, and they are able to envision a different future collectively. This is very important because Albania has emerged from one of the harshest communist dictatorships in the Eastern Bloc, when in the 80s it was considered the North Korea of Europe. So the fact that you have people en masse protesting in the streets, not just in Tirana, but elsewhere in the country as well as in the diaspora, it's a very important political component that should not be disregarded. And this is the momentum now. We are in an accelerated EU integration process. So if something has to change, it has to change now.
Yeah. And one very last question. I mean, Rama and his government have been saying this for quite some time now, that they intend on Albania joining the EU in 2030. Do you see that happening? Regardless of all these problems that Albania is currently facing, do you see that as sustainable?
Well,
or rather realistic, yeah.
Well, I believe that this expedited process for Albania and Montenegro is realistic. The problem, I mean, the question is not if countries like Albania and Montenegro will be part of the European Union, but how this process will be shaped. You know, what would that mean? You know, what would it mean for the citizens? You know, and in Albania, and also what it would mean for the EU, and what does this mean for the enlargement process as such? I think these are the main questions that accompany the process at the moment, and not necessarily if these countries will become part of not of the
And
EU.
to add to that, I mean, from my own perspective, I'm also from Albania, so I can attest to this. I think it's very interesting that the conversation has nowadays shifted to, will this country join the EU? And rather, will the welfare be better of the people? Will we finally have water 24/7? I think these are more important issues. And then from then on, we could get pats on the back in terms of our European integration.
If I may say, you know, it's interesting to see how the main slogan of the protest changed since the first week when the protest started, where the slogan was "Albania is not for sale," to eventually becoming "New Albania." People want to be part in a democratic country that is led by the rule of law and where your basic fundamental rights are not compromised. Albanian citizens at this moment in time are just demanding what many other European citizens are taking perhaps for granted in the EU countries where they reside, where they live. And that is democracy. And I mean, this is a people which has gone through a lot of challenges in these 35 years of a prolonged transition. And they want this to come to an end now. They want to be part of the European Union, but they want to be part of the European Union as equal members in terms of having the same rights that EU citizens have in different EU countries. And this is a matter of democracy, it's a matter of freedom, and it's a matter of dignity, and you can compromise on that.
I agree. I couldn't have ended this episode on a better note, so I thank you so much, Gresa, for joining us, and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sticking to the very end of this episode. It's very much so appreciated. Please support us across all of our social media platforms. And yeah, I'll see you.